Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is a part 2 because when we did our part 1, it turned out we had way too much to talk about for an hour's webinar. So Sarah, just want to move on to the next one. The focus of this is on how you actually choose a specification. So it's kind of one of the early stages of doing exams is working out what it is you're actually going to do. So we'll do a quick recap of the bits that we talked about last time on what are the key things that you need to be thinking about. We will go quite quick on that, but if you want to, the first part of this that we did is up on YouTube. Actually, Sarah, could you find a link and put it in the chat? It's the HEQA channel on YouTube.
Yeah, you just have to watch me do it.
Oh, of course, yeah. So we'll do a quick recap of that, and then we're going to look at the particular options for specifications for some of the main subjects or subject areas. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. If you do have any questions as you go along, you can put your hand up or you can put something into the chat. And if it makes sense to stop where we are, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll get to it at the end. We get to see all your YouTube favorites now. So here we are. This is the HEQA channel. There's also a generally getting started with exams, so how a whole exams process works. So if you kind of want to step back further, you can have a look at that webinar, and that'll explain all the basic idea of how you go about sorting exams at all. If you do have any questions, ask. We were all, the only reason Sarah and I are sitting here is because we were on the other side and we knew nothing before we started doing this. So if you're thinking of, if there's something you don't understand, somebody else will be wondering about it too. So do ask, and then we can get an answer for everybody.
Yeah, just pop questions in the chat at any time. We'll probably try and come back to them at the end so we can get through the webinar bit, but we tend to get distracted by the questions, don't we?
Okay, so we'll skip on to the next slide. So this is a quick recap of what we talked about in the first part. So there is more detail back in that other video if you want to check that later. So the key thing is that you get to choose what exams you're doing when you're home educating. So in school, there's usually quite a set pattern where you'll have maybe 8 and you'll have to do the maths and English and the sciences. Then you maybe get 2 or 3 options from different sets. As a home educator, you choose whatever subjects you like. There's nothing that's compulsory. We would generally say it's worth doing maths and English GCSE because there's a lot of things that rely on those two. It's going to depend on what your child's individual path and interests are. And the other thing is you don't have to take them all at once at the time that they're 16. You can spread them out over different years beforehand. You can do them later if the child isn't ready yet. It's fine to do a couple at year 11 and a couple more the year after and go on to college after that. It really is up to you depending on what your child wants to do. And a really good way to decide that is to sort of have a look at some future paths. So either university courses or college courses, see what the requirements are. If you look at sort of 2 or 3 or 4 of those on websites at different universities or different colleges near you, you'll start to see the pattern of how many GCSEs and what particular subjects you need. So once you've got your idea of what it is that your child wants to do, the key thing is whether you can actually find somewhere sensible to sit that exam. So you're going to be looking for a exam centre that takes private candidates. That could be a commercial exam centre that's basically just set up to help private candidates sit exams. If you've got one of those near you, they will probably do all the different boards, most of the subjects. You tend to have a lot more flexibility. It tends to be a higher cost. It may be a secondary school in your area or a college that you ask around, and other home educators will say, well, we've sat there, they're happy to just open it up and you come and sit in with in a school hall often at the same time as they're taking exams, you can take them. They may have more restrictions on what subjects and boards they support, but it just depends on what's available in your area. You will find if you're prepared to travel, you will be able to do whatever you want to somewhere. It just depends how far you're prepared to go. And the best way to find out is to ask home educators local to you what's available. There is a choice. There is a list on the exams wiki So that's also a good place to start, and start asking at the centres near you what it is that you can sit. But we'll talk about exam boards and exam centres. And the difference between those is the exam board are the people who write and mark the exams. So they sort of generate the exam papers, and the exam centre is the place at which you go when you sit those exams. So the exam centre is responsible for making sure it's the right candidate sitting it, that they're doing it at the right time, they've got any access arrangements that they need. And the exam board is responsible for kind of writing the questions, marking the work that's sent back to them, and giving you a grade. So when you're choosing a specification, that's choosing which exam board, what sort of question paper you're going to get, and what you need to learn in order to do that question paper. And then the exam centre is the physical place that you're going to go to sit those exams. An exam centre will be registered with one or more exam boards. If they're registered with an exam board, they're able to offer you any exam from that board. They may or may not be prepared to do that for all the subjects. They may have just some subjects they're happy for you to take from a particular board, or they may say, that's fine, anything is fine. The key thing, so once you've got an exam centre that is registered with an exam board, the next big important thing to look at is whether there are any practical requirements associated with that exam. So some qualifications are just exam paper based. So the entire grade is based on, usually at GCSE, it's 2 papers that are each about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. And everything about the grade is based on the questions, the answers that you write down to the questions during that whilst you're sitting the exam. There are some other subjects that have additional requirements that aren't written. So that could be something like music, where there's a performance aspect. That could be languages, where there's speaking the language is part of it. It could be design and technology, we've got to make something. Art, where there's a portfolio. Those all make things more difficult for an exam centre. And then there's a kind of an in-between level, which is things like sciences, where there is things that you have to do that are practical. They're not actually part of the grade, but the exam centre has to offer you the opportunity to do that. So we'll get onto this a little bit more later. But essentially, if there is anything in the specification that is more than just coming in, writing an exam and going home again, that makes it more difficult for a centre, and therefore more difficult to find somewhere to sit it. It doesn't make it impossible. You know, there are some centres that have got arrangements with tutors and can offer you almost anything, but it will make it a lot harder. And so it comes down to how far you can travel, how much you're prepared to pay for a tutor. The easiest and simplest thing to do is exam paper only at whatever local centre, whatever boards they're happy to support. And there's also a difference between GCSEs and international GCSEs, often referred to as IGCSEs. So the GCSE is the English or Welsh or Northern Irish, but we're sort of mostly focused on the English ones here. And those are regulated by Ofqual. They're the ones that state schools are allowed to sit. State schools aren't allowed to sit the international GCSEs anymore, but private schools are. So an international GCSE is designed to be at that same level of difficulty. They usually have very similar sorts of content, but they're designed for an international market. They're not regulated by Ofqual. That means they don't have to stick quite as tightly to the way that the GCSEs have been designed and to the rules that they have there. And that means that international GCSEs usually have fewer of those practical requirements, particularly the ones that aren't built into the grade. So we'll talk about science is one of the main ones here, but it comes up with a couple of other subjects as well, where international GCSEs are easier to do, not because the exam itself is any easier, but because it doesn't have those practical requirements, so it's easier for an exam centre to offer it to you to do. And in terms of progression, so as in going on to college or university, international GCSEs are considered just the same as GCSEs. because they are the same difficulty. They're used in other areas as well. It's just that they're often easier for us to sit. And the key place, because we're going to talk about some of the subjects, there's always more. The key place to look is on the HE exams wiki that Sarah is going to show you now.
I muted because I was going to sneeze, but now I'm not. There we go. Right. So the wiki is a website, and it's not particularly run by anyone. It is a collective dumping ground of home educators' experiences and knowledge. So it isn't necessarily always as up to date as it could be in some places, but on the whole, it is your first port of call. I've been working through the subjects for about a year now, trying to make sure they're all up to date. Unfortunately, things change every now and again. I keep having to go backwards. But most of them now have a whole list of resources to do with them. So the subjects page is a good place to start for whatever subject you want to look at. And you can scroll down and you can see the list of subjects. We're going to look at science because we didn't get around to science last time. I spent a long time lately just redoing the science pages. So I'll take us in. Some of the bigger subjects have got categories because they're grouped together. So I'll take us in for the categories page for science. So you can see here we've got some of the common questions that come up to do with these sort of subjects that we see on the groups. So question is, do we need to do a science? The answer is no. As Tracy says, we don't need to do anything. There's nothing compulsory. As I say, maths, English language tend to be the requirements for most things. Science is a requirement for some aspect, some things. So teaching, nursing, actually it's only primary teaching, isn't it, that requires a GCSE. Nursing, if you want to go on and do anything sort of sciencey, even if you think it's not sciencey, something like psychology tends to rely on having science backgrounds. Sciences are one where we have a problem with GCSEs. GCSE sciences, as Katie said earlier, there is a practical component. It's not an exam, and you're not given a grade for it. But exam centres have to offer a list of practicals to all candidates, and they have to sign that they have done that. If they can't offer you the opportunity to do the science practicals, they can't offer you GCSE science. You might find some people are saying that they've done GCSE science. There is always the exception to the rule. There will always be the odd person that has managed to find a centre that will do it. And particularly the last couple of years, there has been a waiving of having to do the practicals down to observing. So it has been easier for centres to offer GCSE science. That has been removed. That is, we are back to they have to be offered. So what do? We do international GCSEs for science. In a way, they work the same. There's a list of core practicals that you need to know for the exam paper. The difference with IGCSEs is the centre doesn't need to sign to say they've offered you the opportunity to do them. All they have to offer you is the exam paper. it's up to you if you do the science practicals. And some of them are perfectly doable at home. And it's a good idea if you can, because firstly, it's a bit of fun to break up the bookwork and it helps embed them. But you can learn them from videos, you can learn them from reading textbooks. You don't have to. So then what are our choices for science? So you have various options for science. You can do single, combined science. So that is a combination of all three main sciences. So by main core sciences, I'm talking biology, physics, chemistry, that is worth 1 GCSE. Or well, IGCSE. Both Cambridge offer it. I get confused which way around it is. It is combined science 1 GCSE, isn't it? Coordinated, that's 2.
Yes, that's it.
They call them different things. Ict quite nicely calls it single science, which is nice and clear. Then you've got an option of double award sciences, which are combined science, again, a third biology, a third chemistry, a third physics, offered by both IGCSE exam boards. You get the equivalent of 2 IGCSEs for it. Then you've got the individual sciences. Sometimes you hear people say we're doing triple science. Triple science actually isn't an award. And if anybody's on the exams group, they'll know that I get on my high horse with this. I sort of rant about this, mainly because I have to deal with candidates in exams as an invigilator when they're worried that they haven't got triple science written on their exam paper. So I do repeat quite often that triple science isn't a thing. So what people mean when they say they're doing triple science is they are doing all 3 of the core individual sciences. So a GCSE, an IGCSE in biology, an IGCSE in chemistry, an IGCSE in physics.
And actually, that sort of works in reverse, in that the double science, certainly for Edexcel, is actually just the paper 1 of the single sciences. So for if you're doing the double science award across all 3 sciences, your paper 1 will, no, so if you're doing a physics, say single one, your paper 1 will say it's double science, because that paper is shared. And then if you're doing the single award, you do an extra paper with the extra content in it.
Yeah, it does. It does go, there you go, there's a nice little diagram that shows it.
There we are.
So this is just for Edexcel. For Cambridge, they're totally different papers. So as home educators, we can choose to do any of the core sciences. We can do 1, we can do 2, we can do all 3. We can do combined sciences. We can do no science, or we can choose to do one of the extra things such as human biology. Environmental management has an element of science in it. So we have a lot of alternatives with science, which is brilliant, but I know it's one of those things that worries people.
And I would say, if you're looking at it because you want to be keeping options open in terms of maybe that primary teaching or a university that you think might require a science, then the 3 main sciences are the safest bet. You may be able to use human biology, or astronomy or something like that, one of those sort of science adjacent subjects, but you can't count on that quite as much. If they say they want a science GCSE, they may well mean just one of those, biology, chemistry or physics.
Or combined.
Yeah, or certainly the double. And again, with the combined, that's a single award, that's not as commonly, that's not something that is used within state schools, so it sort of may or may not be accepted. just a little bit more risky if you're using
There
it as a qualification.
There is a single combined GCSE.
Is there?
Yes, AQA Synergy.
Okay, no, I
But
didn't know there was.
It's not commonly sat.
Yeah.
Their double award is helpfully called Trilogy. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's wonderful, the science papers.
Yeah, so it's worth looking at the specs because they've all got very slightly different names, and they all come down to being one of these 3-in-1, 3-in-2, or separate sciences, but you've got to kind of read it through and actually see what it's talking about because they have different names for them all. The other thing with science is that the GCSEs, so if you've come out of school later on, they've been doing a particular GCSE science, they have tiers for GCSE. So they have a foundation and a higher. And the difference between those is that higher will have more content in it. And also the exam papers will have more complicated questions. So with a foundation, you can get up to a grade 5. And with a higher paper, you can get between a grade 4 and a grade 9. So depending on what grade you're expected to get, the schools will put you in for either foundation, which has more limited content and more straightforward questions, or the higher, where you can get the higher grades, but it's more content and more complicated questions. If you're doing the Edexcel International GCSE, which is the one that most home educators, I think, use significantly more than Cambridge, that doesn't have tiers. There's just one exam paper that covers that whole range from a grade 1 up to a grade 9. Cambridge does have the option of tiers, so that might be a factor in which one of those you choose. But yeah, I would say there are more resources and more experience around for the Edexcel International GCSE.
And also there's fewer papers, which is often a factor of people if they're travelling a fair distance. We probably could fill an entire session talking about the sciences. So what I'll do is do a quick run through where to find the information on the wiki. And then if anybody's got any direct questions about it, we can come to them later. So if we say there's the sciences page, you can find through it information about combined sciences and the individual core sciences. And then I've tagged in astronomy, human biology. I'll show you an example of how we've got for the pages. So you've got a few questions. It tells you when the syllabus started from, when it's available, because IGCSEs are usually available twice a year, not all of them, but starting to be more. Hopefully they're changing next year, but hopefully it's clear from at some point I'm going to have to go and change every single page again next year. It tells you the code. The specification code is what you'll be asked for when you book. The link takes you to the exam board's website where you can find all their information about it, and you need to familiarise yourselves with these pages. The download.
So what you have here is you have the specification that tells you all of the things that you need to learn. It's not a textbook, so it'll say something like you need to know about electrolysis, and you'll need to go off to find a textbook or whatever it is that actually tells you what electrolysis is. But the specification lists everything that they can ask you about in an exam, essentially. And this is also where you can find past papers and some other sorts of teaching materials that the exam board provides for you for free.
Yeah, so we've got linked to those because they're the essential place to go and read. What we've got on the wiki is basically a summary of relevant bits. Pulled out some of the content to give you an idea of what's involved. The assessment, you can see it says 100% exam based. So that means there's no practical components. Tells you what sort of papers, what's involved. And then not all the subjects are quite in this form yet, but we're getting there. There's a list of resources. So there's quite often more than one textbook for a particular course. It's personal choice when there's more than one. Have a look at we've got sample pages, have a look inside. Sometimes it's worth asking on the exams group, because you'll find sometimes there is a bias against one textbook or towards one, but largely it is. Some people like one book and some people like another. It's if they've been endorsed, which the ones listed here will be, that means the exam board has said you can learn the content from this. It's as simple as that. So they will be fine to use any of them that are listed. And then there's extra ones, workbooks, revision books. Any of this you use is up to you. Shall I go back to the
Yeah, I think
we covered science. We can come back.
Yeah, we covered science, and I'll just say now that exams wiki has that for lots of different subjects. So if there's anything we don't mention, go and have a look on the wiki and you'll be there as well. And we'll just go through some other subjects now.
So, languages. So you'll sometimes see people say on the group, oh, you need to do Gcse to avoid the speaking and listening. That's generally a confusion to do with English language. English language has a optional speaking and listening element on the Gcses, and I won't go too much into it for the GCSE because we covered that on the last video. It's sort of optional and sort of not, but the gist of it is it's generally a lot better for home educators to do GCSE for English language. It avoids a lot of complications. For modern foreign languages, there is a speaking and listening exams as part of GCSEs as well. So the GCSEs are actually pretty much a mirror of the GCSEs. For Edexcel, certainly there are 4 papers exactly the same. One's reading, one's writing, one's speaking, one's listening. It is possible to find centres to do them. It's not usually that difficult. Schools will do them as well as commercial centres, but you need to go ahead. Don't assume. That is one to go and check with your exam centre as early as possible. There may be limits on which they may tell you which specification they are going to do, that you have to do it at that centre. They might not give you a choice because they need to provide somebody that's going to do the speaking exam with you. The speaking exam tends to be about a 10-minute conversation. They give you topics to talk about, and it's early in the exam series. That's worth knowing that quite often it's April, early May. So people can get caught out by that. So you might be given, you might be told that you have to do AQA because that's what's taught at the school, and therefore they've got a teacher that's familiar with it who can do the speaking and listening. The speaking component, the listening, that's a CD, or they're all downloads now as of this year. So that is listening in an exam to a recording and answering questions on the exam paper. We can do other languages, the more classical ancient languages, classical Greek, Latin. They're exam-based only and don't cause problems. I think we've even got Sanskrit written on the wiki page. Somebody's done Sanskrit at some point, biblical Hebrew. So there are a wide choice of languages, but you have to go out and make sure that you've got the centre before you start studying. There are also
there's some very unusual languages as well, but again, those become much more difficult to actually find someone who's able to do the speaking assessment for them. So there's Russian, there's Persian, I think there's Mandarin and Japanese and things, but you need to work with a centre that has links to a tutor that can do those for you. And it's probably worth figuring that out before you set your heart on getting that as a qualification. The other thing that can be useful with languages is there are often alternative international qualifications. So there's a DELF one for French, for instance, and there may be different assessments. They may be able to do that online or remotely, and that can be easier to access depending on what's available than the GCSE.
The only one that I will point out with languages is we say there's not a vast amount of differences between GCSE and IGCSE in terms of access. So it's just a case of asking the exam centre. Apart from Cambridge, the speaking and listening, I add that listening all the time. The speaking component for Edexcel IGCSE and the GCSEs are externally marked. So it's recorded. The one for Cambridge is internally marked, so it's harder to find an exam centre that will do Cambridge.
And another slight difference between the GCSE and the Edexcel IGCSE is that the GCSE has tiers again, so it has that foundation option that is simpler, less content, but you can only get up to a grade 5, and the higher option, whereas with IGCSE there's just one option that covers the whole range. Right, shall I move on to ICT and computer science? So these are two sort of different variants of dealing with computers. Computer science involves quite a lot of programming and more about sort of how computers work, and ICT is a bit more hands-on, sort of networking and actually using computers more. ICT is more difficult to be able to access. I think it has quite a large practical component. So there are a couple of commercial centres that do it, or you might get lucky with a school that does it for their own pupils and will let you sit it alongside. But generally, ICT is quite difficult to be able to sit and find a centre for. And computer science has similar problems for the GCSE. It's one of those where the grade is only based on the exam, but the exam centre has to offer you I think it's a 15-hour practical programming component. So they have to have supervised you for that whole time to make sure that you've done it and signed off the exam centre, which essentially means they're very unlikely to do it as a private candidate. So the paper that is only exam paper based is Cambridge International GCSE for computer science. So the vast majority of home educators will do that one, and you just have to find a centre that can support Cambridge, and then it's just exam papers. Edexcel IGCSE doesn't have that 15-hour component, but it does have an on-screen practical exam. So again, you might be able to find more centres that can do that, but they do have to have the computer set up and be familiar with the technology and able to get all that to work for it. So it's kind of in the middle. It's a bit easier than the GCSE to find access for, but it's not as easy as the Cambridge one.
So I'm jumping on to history.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. So I spend a lot of time, for the record, I am a history tutor at Fairgos. So I spend a lot of time talking people through different history specs. One of my specialist skills is being able to tell from a list of random topics what spec people have been studying at school. It's a bit of a game. So history is exam based. So you have a lot of options for history. You can do the 2 IGCSEs, so either Cambridge or Edexcel IGCSE. You can do Edexcel GCSE. You can do HEQA GCSE. You can do EDUCAS GCSE. There are 2 OCR papers. OCR, one of them has a schools history project, which sounds lovely that you study a local site, but to get the paperwork signed off for that, it's an absolute nightmare. So that one probably won't happen. So generally with history, it is worth going to ask your centre before you start studying what boards you can do. Because as I say, most of them are on the table. It's only really that OCR one, I can't remember if it's A or B off the top of my head, I think it's B, that causes a problem of the English boards anyway. The Welsh one is different, that's got coursework. But because there might be restrictions at the centre because of things such as storing exam papers, because history has so many options. Because most history specs, you need to decide within there what topics you are going to study as well. With the GCSEs, it's usually you pick 4 out of, you've got 4 option groups and you have to pick 1 of each. EdXL, IGCSE is, you've got 3 option groups and you pick 2 from one of them and 1 from each of the other 2. And Cambridge, they are changing the spec for next year, so I don't know off the top of my head. They've reduced the number. It used to be 8 topics, but they're changing it next year. I think it's going down to 5. They've taken away about 4 and they're adding another 1. So really with history, it's just a case of reading up on the different specs, ask questions, check with your exam centre which you can do. If in doubt, ask on the groups. I will say there are more resources for the GCSEs, particularly EdXL and HEQA. Not all of the EdXL GCSE topics have textbooks available for them.
And I think in general, there'll be some topics that have got more resources.
Oh, there always is, yeah.
Because there's some that are kind of the favourites that get used.
Yeah, because the HEQA, not all of them have got books. The only one that I know that everything's got a book for, at least one book, is EdXL GCSE, which is the most popular one sat in schools. Cambridge, you have a Route A and a Route B. Route A is 19th century, Route B is 20th century. There are no published resources for Route A. There's a guide, but there's no official textbook for Route A. There is an unofficial one knocking around, actually written by a home educator, but there's no official resources for it. They're bringing out new textbooks, but not up, because I said the spec is changing, so it's changing enough that the new textbooks, they're not quite out yet. That's really it with history. Read up, ask questions about it.
And one thing that actually applies to all of the subjects, I suppose, is if you want to use a distance learning provider, so a course that's kind of set up for you, that will usually be targeted at one particular specification and one particular set of options. So it can be a bit circular. You may have a spec that you really want to do, so you go and find a course provider that does that if you don't want to study it yourself independently. Or you might have a course provider that you like the look of, and so you're going to have to do whatever spec they're going to teach you. But if you're studying it for yourself, just from textbooks and your own resources, which is perfectly doable, a lot of home educators will do that for the majority of their subjects, then you get to choose whatever you like.
And the other thing I'll add with history is some of the specs have a small bit that changes every year. Cambridge, the focus paper 2 changes every year. I haven't totally read the new spec in depth to check if that's still the case, but I'm expecting it to be the case. I think with my skim read it has. I won't say for certain because of the change. AQA, the historical environment changes every year. So you need to know when you are going to sit the exams ahead of. It's harder to just change your mind through sitting it. But that's only a small part of the course, so it's not such a major thing, but it might mean you're redoing it again. Should I do geography?
Yeah.
Yeah, geography, you can't do GCSE. I'll put that straightforward. It's one of those ones that it's not even, you may find somewhere that will do it. They have to sign that you have done 2 days of practical field work, and they have to and they have to be able to say what you were doing as part of the field work to do the GCSE. It isn't even offered by commercial centres. Usually there's a big chain that tends to do most things. They don't do GCSE geography. So you need to look at the GCSEs. So Cambridge or Edexcel, for both of those, you're expected to know about field work. Ideally, you want to do it, but nobody signs to say you've done it. You are asked questions about it on the exam. So you can learn about it through books, videos, other ways, but it's a lot more accessible. Do you want to jump onto another one?
Yeah, we'll humanities and social sciences will kind of lump all together. We'll go a bit quicker now and not go into individual subjects. So this is things like psychology, sociology, economics, citizenship, business. Now, in those cases, there's sometimes more differences between the specs. So, for instance, with psychology, there's some sections that you have to do, and then there's 5 different topics that they're allowed to choose between, and the different boards have sometimes chosen different topics to focus on. So, for instance, if you're doing something like maths, then generally it doesn't matter that much which board, because it'll all cover very similar content, particularly if you're doing the GCSE. For the social sciences, it does matter a bit more that you've got things for the right spec, and the textbooks and things that you're using are for the right spec, because they can be fairly different between the different boards. Most of those are exam paper only, so they're all fine to do. The exception to that is citizenship, which has a project that you need to do, which Sarah knows a bit more about.
It isn't one to be scared of, though. It's not marked, so it is well worth asking even schools if they will sign it off, because it's relatively low work for them to do. Doesn't mean they will, but it's always worth asking, because I think it's a great subject. I do. It's a really, really good first subject. I will say that. You often hear environmental management put forward as a first subject. I have to say we hated it, but we don't do science. For us coming from a more humanities background, I think that citizenship is a good one. But as I say, you do need a centre that will do the help you sign off the investigation.
And there is a global citizenship, which I think still has a project to be done, but it doesn't need to be signed off in the same way.
No, it doesn't need signing off in the same way.
So yeah, that's that. And then music, drama, art, PE, and design and technology. These are all the ones that are very hard to do. There are a couple of places that can do music and that can do art, but you will need to use a tutor that's affiliated with them. So that means that you'll be paying for tutoring throughout, which makes it a lot more expensive, because they need to be able to supervise your portfolio or your performance work and to know that that was your student who created it. And you have to be affiliated, they have to be affiliated with a particular exam centre. So you may need quite substantial travel to get there if it's not close to you. Similarly, drama is even more difficult because it involves a group project. What you will find with several of these is sometimes there is a local group, particularly with drama, that is just set up to do it. There's a dance one as well. And again, there may be a dance studio that is set up to offer the GCSE local to you. So if that's the case, that's fabulous. Or if someone else says we were able to do it, that's great, but it will depend if that option is available to you locally. Generally speaking, they're ones that are quite hard, and people will often look at alternatives for those. So, you know, there are standard music grades. There's Lambda, LAMDA, I think, that do something similar to music grades for drama. Arts, there are arts awards, silver and bronze, silver and gold arts awards. PE, there's various different sporting qualifications that you might look at doing instead. If you're looking at those for college entry, it's worth talking to the college early on. They may or may not accept an alternative instead. or they may be prepared to go on a portfolio or an audition for those practical subjects. So that's it. Explore different options for those if you don't have anything available to you locally. Right, I think that's all of the main subjects covered, at least briefly. As we said, everything else is on the exams wiki. I think if there's a GCSE that is available, it'll be on there somewhere. If not, there's also a Facebook group.
There are a lot of the languages aren't there yet.
That's true, yes, there are.
Because there's so many languages, and nobody's put marine science up there yet. So that's a job for the summer.
2024, is it, or is it this year?
Yeah, 2024 are the first exams.
Yeah.
So we've still got time, but so.
And if you've heard about the natural science GCSE that's being introduced, they are aiming that for first teaching in 2025. So it's a little way off yet. First exams in 2027. People have been quite keen on that one, but it'll wait a while. So
have we got any questions? There was one that was about specimen papers versus past papers.
Yeah.
So specimen papers are something that was written by the exam board so that everyone could see at the start. When they produce a qualification, it's 2 years before the first exams. So produce a specimen paper so that teachers have an idea of what the exam paper is going to look like. And if they make changes, substantial changes to the spec, they might change the specimen paper. Sometimes they're called sample papers. Sometimes you have both if you're lucky, because they feel like you might need more than one. I think for history, there's a choice of specimen or sample just to confuse matters. But they're the same thing, really. They're papers that the exam board have written that nobody has sat in exam conditions. They are there to show teachers and whoever's looking at the exam qualification what the paper will look like.
So they come with mark schemes, but they won't have grade boundaries. So it's only grade boundaries only get set once an exam paper has been sat by people. So there's not a particular mark that means you get a grade 9 or a grade 8. That varies very slightly every year so that they can match the difficulty of different papers against each other. So specimen papers won't have a grade boundary with them. You'll be able to work out a mark, but you won't be able to say what grade that would have been. Every single GCSE, and I think all the IGCSEs follow this as well, must have at least a specification and a sample paper publicly available to anyone on their website. They can choose to offer other things, so there's things like sample papers, and they can choose whether those are locked or unlocked. So if you have a look,
yeah, I've got this one
on the page, you have a look at
this one. This is where I'm checking. I'm just thinking, am I logged in? Just had to torpedo the plan.
So just have a look on the exam materials, I think. So,
yeah, so I'm under teaching and learning. So
oh yeah,
there's I looked at the samplers. Oh, there's not many. Let's do under examples.
So there's often quite useful things here. The exemplars are sort of examples of different types of answers that students might give and what marks they will get. So that can be useful to you to kind of figure out what it is examiners are looking for, what you need for full marks.
Yeah, you get often things, assessment guidance, mapping documents to look at that can compare different specs. And this is a brilliant one if you that compares single, double and separate sciences for Edexcel. So it tells you what content is on each one. You can access past training content, which is less useful because you can't hear anyone, so you're just looking at the slides. But yeah, they're there. Qualification guides can be really helpful at telling you how to mark. They're not telling you how to answer, they're for teachers. So it's about discussing how to mark a lot of them. So what assessment objectives are being tested in each question and things like that. So some of them have more in than others of that, but they are well worth a read. Scheme of work, some people swear by them. I personally find them not so. They're worth a look because they usually have extra resources on there, but they're written for schools, so they tend to follow.
Yeah, I actually use those just for kind of planning the topics. So I don't necessarily go through what they are, but it gives me kind of roughly how many weeks you ought to be spending on each, or how many lessons on each topic. So you can kind of, they do it over, I think, about 60 weeks, because if they do it as a 2-year course. So depending on how many weeks you've got, you can sort of see how far through the scheme of work you might need to be at any particular point.
Suggestions of examples and
some of them are easier than others. Some of them kind of go with a textbook, so if you're using that textbook, it can be quite useful.
We're looking at the exam materials. So different boards do them in different ways about how they put them on the site. Excel put all their papers there. They just have some of them locked. So you can see a little padlock. AQA do it slightly different. They, once they've been released to the public, they're on their main site, but they've got they've got a secure site for centres. Not even all teachers have logins, by the way. I think that's a common perception, that all teachers have access to everything, and they don't.
So the padlock means that they're keeping it secure on the exam centre website. It's obviously not as secure as a regular exam paper would be, because they have been out in the wild, people have sat them and they can talk about them. But they try and keep them so that schools can use them for mocks and have a fair idea that the students won't have just learned all the answers beforehand. And there's different numbers of them locked at the moment. GCSEs, I think, have all but the last up to 2000. So they have before 21 is available, and after 21 and 22 at the moment are locked. Edexcel are locking more on their international GCSEs at the moment. I'm hoping that at some point they'll start unlocking them again, but because they were used as the method for grading when the exams were cancelled for COVID, they've got a bit more concerned about keeping those secure.
The other thing we'll mention is a question that comes up an awful lot on the exams group. What does R mean on the papers? Quite simply, the international papers have usually at least 2 versions of them because of different time zones. So they try to sit papers at the same time. There's a window of when they're allowed to start. So all the countries offering one paper will have to start it within this hour slot, regardless of their time period. So it doesn't really work when you've got 12-hour differences around the world. So the R is a different time zone, and Cambridge do 3 for some of them. And I can never remember which way around the numbers and the papers are for the Cambridge. I have to look it up every single time.
I think the UK is administration zone 3, but I would double check that.
Oh, we're administration zone 3, but I think we're a different one when we talk to which papers we sit. I think we sit paper 2. I can never remember whether the 2 is first and the area is first and the paper number is.
And it shouldn't matter, because the exam centre should sort that bit out for you. All you need to know is that these are different papers, but you can use any of them for practice. They're all sort of same content. They were just sat at different times, so they're all fine for practice.
No, exam boards are as useful as the chocolate teapot when you've called them by phone. Speaking for somebody who works at an exam centre, we don't get very clear answers out of exam boards. And
they're often not very familiar with private candidate kind of considerations. So you are generally better off going to the Facebook exams group for any query, because we'll tell you how it works for home educators. They might give you the answer for schools, or sort of the technical answer based on the spec, but actually that's just not how it works in real life. So for instance, people have rung up and they've asked about GCSE sciences, and they've said, oh, well, it's not there's no practical requirement as part of the exam. It's like, well, it's not graded, but there is that issue where the exam centre needs to sign off. And for a student in a school, that's what they care about. What's my grade based on? But for us, that little bit of extra knowledge is important, and the customer services staff don't often know that well. But I would say, sort of, if you're in a situation where things have got very complicated and they're going wrong, it can be worth going to the exam board in that situation. Sort of for general queries, just come look on the wiki, come to the Facebook group, ask one of us if you need to, and you'll get better information. But if you've ended up in a sticky situation with an exam centre, it can then be worth going to the exam board. There's an extra kind of level of people to help you out there.
Yeah, if you've got a problem that will get you through to somebody that's beyond the initial customer service, then it's worth doing. If it's just a customer service level query, if you can't understand it from reading the specification on the exam page or from the wiki page, I say the exams group is a good answer. And I know Katie and I both deal with questions all the time, so we don't mind. It's there's always somebody that will answer. Some of it can be worth asking your exam centre, but there's it depends on your exam centre is about how relevant it is to them. There's a question about how much hand holding they can do, about what's reasonable to expect.
And I mean, it isn't always the case, but sort of generally speaking, if it's a commercial centre who's sort of set up that you're the customer and you're paying them a reasonable amount, it's sort of more reasonable to ask them questions. Whereas if it's a school that is sort of doing it as a favour for home educators and most of their time is focused on schools, then you kind of want to not spend too much of their time helping you out. Question: have I heard some home educators saying that getting papers can be unlocked sometimes? So for this summer, and I'm hoping this will go forward, but it'll be in negotiations, there was an arrangement with Edexcel and also with the other exam boards that if you could show them that you were sitting an exam this summer, you were able to request some of those unlocked papers to be sent to you directly from the exam board. That on Edexcel, if you have a look, you find a private candidate page. There was a kind of a process you had to go through, which was to sign a declaration that you were a private candidate, you were sitting an exam shortly, and you weren't going to share the papers with anybody else. And if you sort of sent that all off to them and they could see that, that was true, you had an entry in and you were a private candidate, they were able to send you some of the locked papers. But you kind of want to leave that till quite close to the exam. And we are, as HEQA, we are still talking to them about trying to get those unlocked, perhaps back to the situation where they were before, which was where they were the last paper was locked for about 9 months, and then they were all released before the main exams, and that was kind of workable. So we're hoping we can get back there, but it's all still a bit nervous with contingencies at the moment.
Why can I not find them?
Oh, it's always in a slightly strange place.
Yeah, it's in the
it's on the private candidate page.
Yeah,
it's not on there.
No, I've gone into private papers, but we can find the link. It's all over the exams group, haven't we? So do you want to find it to you? I will take over my page. I don't really want to show my Facebook to everybody. So it's also as well, you can ask your exam centre. So
yes, they're allowed to give them out as well.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll find that as we move away from exam cancellations, it becomes less of an issue. I think this year there was a big fear that we were going to have to suddenly use them all for grading. So even the centre I work at, which is probably one of the more helpful ones towards private candidates, as we're home educators, most of us, we didn't release all papers because we had that fear that not until we were pretty certain that exams were going ahead.
And as a parent, my daughters were sitting exams this summer and I didn't request the latest ones. So with Edexcel, they had quite a lot more locked and they would kind of give you an extra couple of sets, but still keep several sets locked. And I didn't push for those because I knew that if exams were cancelled and we'd had access to them, we wouldn't be able to get a grade this summer based on those papers. So it was worth keeping them locked so that we had that option. And so hopefully we'll get further and further away from that situation, but we'll see. Now everyone knows that it can happen. They might be a bit more concerned about keeping one of them. But again, in particular, last year and the year before, a lot of these specifications changed so that there were a new specification had first exams in 2019. So that meant that there weren't very many past papers available. And again, the further we get into them, the more past papers there are unlocked, that they can have unlocked and still keep some locked. So it becomes less of an issue. All right, have we got any other questions from anybody?
So have you got any questions about any specific subjects? In between us, we cover most of them. I think the only ones we've got, neither of us have done a foreign language.
No.
That we.
And it's worth knowing you don't have to do a language. I think there may be one university that, or at least at one point, insists on a foreign language. Now I don't think they do. I think you just have to study it if you haven't got one. But
yeah,
generally speaking, if you don't want to, you can find somewhere to go that's fine. And there are a couple of more unusual subjects which we haven't done, but they're available, things like accounting, commerce. What else was there on the list? I said Persia, classical civilizations. We didn't cover ancient history, so some things that you don't get as much in school. So it's worth just having a look down the subjects thing to see if there's anything that kind of takes your fancy.
Yeah, you often find when people come out of school, they focus on what they can't do from what they were doing in school. And yes, there are some things which are more difficult, but at the same time, we've got so many more options in terms of the academic level of qualification, sort of the academic qualifications. So no matter what your interests are, there's a lot there that you can do. And we generally cover a subject a lot quicker than the school would. Schools, they tend to make options choices, sometimes in year 8, more going back to 2 years, so year 9, and then you study them for 2 years. We don't have to do that in home ed. You can decide what you want to study when you want to study it, and study it over, well, we've done anything from 4 months to 3 years to cover a syllabus, just depending on the pace we were going, and COVID exam cancellations don't really help, but it's in your thing to actually go out there, use the wiki as your base. I say there are more subjects than are listed there, so use the exam boards. They will take you to the links from there. Explore it, ask questions, ask on your local home ed groups where people are using for exams, which will help you. Find people who've sat exams locally. It's always worth having a chat.
And yeah, the aim is to do some more in this series. I think we haven't quite set a date yet, but the plan is we'll do one about how you plan out doing a GCSE next, I think, because we both quite like doing that.
Yeah, we just have to decide whether we can face doing an August one.
Yes.
So I think we're pretty much finished.
I think that's it. Thank you, everybody.
Questions? Thank you for coming along. If you've got any questions, say pop them on the exams group, or you can ask one of us at any time.
Yeah, if you want to email me, my email address is katie@heqa.uk.
I tend to give out my Fairgos one, so it's s.large@fairgos.org.
There we go. So, thank you. We're going to stop the recording now.